I'm Catel Le Goulven, and this is Mission to Change, the show where I hear from people who turn business into a force for good and learn about their journey to make it happen.
It's kind of the opposite of the Olympics. In the Olympics, everybody wants to be first across the line. And oftentimes when it comes to sustainability in business, people don't necessarily want to be coming last, but they're quite happy for someone else to sort of be first across the line, and then they'll be second, third, or fourth.
Today, I meet with Nicole Rycroft, founder and executive director of Canopy, a non-profit organization using the marketplace to protect the world's endangered forests. Nicole is on a mission to save our forests and advance the right of frontline communities.
I'm Nicole Rycroft. I'm Canopy's founder and executive director, and Canopy is a solutions-driven, not-for-profit organization that's focused on protecting the world's forests, biodiversity, climate, and helping to advance frontline community rights. So the way that Canopy works is we help companies to develop cutting-edge environmental policies, and then we work with them back through their supply chain to be able to successfully implement those policies. We want to make a really meaningful contribution to 30 to 50% of the world's forests being conserved. Now, perhaps not surprisingly, that's a big stretch from where we are today.
It's a big stretch indeed. According to the World Resources Institute, only 15% of our global forest cover remains intact today. The rest has been cleared, degraded, or fragmented. A particular concern is the loss of humid primary forest, the mature rainforest that is especially important for biodiversity and carbon storage. In 2019 alone, we lost the equivalent of a football pitch of primary forest every 6 seconds for the entire year. Several industries are responsible for this loss, but pulp and paper heads the pack, using 40% of all industrial wood traded globally. Nicole's mission to turn this around started as a little girl raised close to Australia's nature.
I come by my love of forests, honestly. My grandmother had a very infectious love of wild places, and I spent a lot of time with her as a kid. And she would often be taking me down to the park or for walks in forests, or making me watch wildlife documentaries, which at the time during summer holidays felt like torture. But I think it helped set my compass to gravitate towards forest ecosystem. The forests in Australia, they're hot, and in that heat, there's a release of eucalyptus oil, so it's very pungent. They're very noisy, birds and cicadas. And so there's just an intensity to the experience with the heat and the sound and the smells of being in the bush in Australia that I think it's just been woven into my fabric from a very early stage. And so I was very lucky as a child to get to spend a lot of time in nature and became quite attached to it. Now, that didn't mean that my early professional career automatically took me towards working on forest conservation, but it did set me up with a real passion and care.
This is not something that you studied or you worked on, initially in your career. Is that right?
Yes. No, I was a physiotherapist and an elite level athlete in Australia. So, on face value, nothing about either of those professions has anything to do with running an international NGO that works with the business community to advance forest conservation. But in hindsight, they were both actually perfect training. As a physiotherapist, it's really important that you look for the systemic cause of the problem, not just the symptom, right? It's very easy to treat the symptom, but unless you actually address the root cause of the problem, then you're not actually going to resolve the issue for any length of time. And then, of course, as an athlete, there's just the tenacity and focus on outcomes that you need to bring to performing as an athlete on a national level. That tenacity is really helpful when you work on sustainability and environmental conservation.
Nicole's elite rowing and physiotherapy career shaped her skills and mindset. But it was an illness that triggered her change of path to join the forest conservation movement.
It was such a gift in hindsight because those moments really help you focus on what's important in life and what you want to be doing with your life. And so that episode was really the catalyst for me to start on the trajectory to shift where I spent more of my life force working to advance conservation.
Through a series of fieldworks in Southeast Asia and Northern America, Nicole witnessed firsthand the devastating impact our economic model was having on communities and on the environment.
It just became very clear that it didn't really matter whether it was human rights violations or environmental degradation. It was all happening under the umbrella of the global economy, and that this supply and demand dynamic that we have built into the economy, unsustainable consumption and production, was leaving a trail of destruction behind it. But did that actually have to be the case?
Nicole joined local conservation organizations in West Canada and sought to halt the effects of global consumption at the source by participating in blockades and protests against the logging industry. But it didn't take long for her to recognize that the few successes they'd had didn't measure to the size of the problem at hand.
I think civil disobedience is an important part of civil society and democratic societies. But for me, it felt like I was only treating the symptom and that we needed to actually address the systemic cause, which is that we are using the world's forests and other natural systems unsustainably. And so that was where the idea for Canopy came about. And so I approached a number of organizations around the idea of building an initiative that would be global in scope, so that we didn't just shift the problem from one forest ecosystem to another, and that it would be collaborative. Because at that time, there was this perceived chasm between the business community and the conservation community. And I was really focused on building a bridge between business and conservation. Just because I'm a professional tree hugger, that I am work full time on forest conservation, it doesn't mean that I'm the only person that cares about clean water and a stable climate or fresh air. Executives, CEOs, board members of companies care just as deeply about those qualities as I do.
It is on the premise that business and conservation do not have to be confrontational that Nicole founded Markets Initiative, that would later be known as Canopy, a global nonprofit with a budget of $2 million. But at the start, it was a one-woman show with a tiny budget.
I started Markets Initiative in 1999, and there was no grand, office opening, as you can imagine, with an $1,800 budget in the first year. I was living on the very, very west coast of Vancouver Island at the time. And so I would literally start my days. I would go for a surf in the morning, and then I would come back home and just start ringing companies to see if they were interested in developing policies and putting in place sustainability measures. And at that time, CSR, except for a very few sort of very forward-looking companies, wasn't really deeply rooted in companies actually looking at their supply chains, looking at their core business practices. And so to start off with, I didn't get a lot of calls back. I'm sure I was just shy of getting a restraining order taken out against me for the number of times that I would call people and they would never call me back. Because, of course, they were like, we're an electronics company, or we're a personal care and beauty kind of company. What have we got to do with forest conservation?
Nicole's tenacity eventually paid off. At the end of her first year, she had convinced 30 brands to commit to no longer sourcing from high carbon, high biodiversity value forests, and to adopt other progressive conservationist policies. Despite this initial success, it became clear that for Canopy to trigger real change, it would have to concentrate all its efforts on one single industry.
45% of the forests that are logged around the world ultimately end up in paper products. And so 75% of the fiber that was being used to make paper was biologically rich and diverse forest ecosystems, not just plantations and recycled content. So book publishing, it's about ideas, it's about paper that carries a heavy environmental footprint. And publishers are, they're very well read, oftentimes politically progressive. And of course, there are authors that are generally very supportive of environmental causes. And so it just felt that book publishing was a good place to start to really test this idea or this concept of working to try and transform an entire supply chain.
Canopy helps companies to develop environmental policies and then works with them to implement these policies through their supply chains. It identifies pain points in the supply chains and focuses its energy there to unlock change. After educating herself with the ins and outs of the book publishing industry, Nicole approached publishers who are key actors of change. But in an industry with tight profit margins, they were unwilling to produce alternatives without an assured market, until Nicole met one person who could change their minds.
Alice Munro is a much loved and celebrated author, and her publisher had made a commitment that they were going to start transitioning their publishing, the publishing of their books onto papers that had high recycled content, and if it had any virgin wood fiber content, it would be Forest Stewardship Council certified wood, and they were wanting to take it very slowly. And I managed to have a conversation with Alice about her book. And she was involved and was supportive of environmental issues. And so she asked me to fax her some information. It was back in the day of faxes. And she literally stopped the presses. I hadn't realized that perhaps her book was going to print quite as soon as it was at the time, but she literally picked up the phone and called her publisher and said, Doug, I want my book printed on environmental paper. And so her book, literally, it stopped the press. I received a call very shortly after that call, probably from the general manager of the publisher, saying, have you been speaking to one of our authors? And now how do we actually, access the paper at the volume that we need to be able to keep this book on schedule?
Not longer after this initial breakthrough with Alice Munro, another opportunity arose that had the potential to send shockwaves through the book publishing industry. And Nicole knew she couldn't let it pass her by.
The biggest print runs at the time were essentially Harry Potter and the Bible. We knew with Harry Potter that we had a live author that would be able to support the communications work, and that it just not only would we be able to benefit from and leverage the massive print run of that book, but that we would also be able to work with the cultural phenomenon that was associated with Harry Potter. And so we approached the Canadian publisher of Harry Potter, which is Raincoast Books. We had a policy with them already in place, and had been very steadily working with them towards the fifth book in the series when it came out, being printed on environmental paper. But we had to speed date them with a paper mill to produce a paper that would have the qualities that they needed, as well as the environmental qualities that we were aiming for. And then the rest is, Harry Potter history. Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, which was the fifth book in the series, was printed on 100% post-consumer recycled paper here in Canada. It was the only edition of Harry Potter that was printed on environmental paper. And we reached out to Jo Rowling to lend support to the book, which she was very happy to do. We sent her an FSC certified Quidditch stick as part of our outreach, and just let her know that, her Canadian publisher had done something quite remarkable that she could be proud of. And so she really lent in behind it and gave her full support. She wrote a quote for the front of the book. She started to engage her other publishers globally. We had a lot of fun with it.
The efforts of Canopy, working closely with J.K. Rowling and her team, ensured that the sixth Harry Potter book was made using 100% recycled paper in Canada and 8 other countries. And that for the seventh and final book of the series, it happened in 26 countries worldwide. Can you evaluate the influence, the impact that Canopy has had on that industry? And do you have some numbers you can share with me on that impact?
There has been a sea shift in the way that book publishing is done and the kinds of papers, the environmental impacts and footprint of the papers that are used. You have huge global publishers like Penguin Random House that are now, 90% of their print runs are now on papers with environmental qualities, high recycled content, FSC content. That's an amazing shift that we've seen through that supply.
That's great. Yeah, that was your blueprint, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. So, reapply the blueprint, but recognize that every industry has different pressures and different actors and different sort of nuances that you need to account for. But at the very core of our model is that business adage that the customer is always right. And so, these large customer companies have an incredible ability to create the economic incentives for their supply chains to change from business as usual practice to fundamentally more sustainable performance.
Canopy's next stop was the fashion industry, to make sure that brands would stop sourcing viscose and rayon from forest products. And here, Canopy's impact and results are also really impressive.
We now have 330 brand partners who are formally part of Canopy Style. Those brands represent $580 billion in annual revenues, and they're, companies like H&M and Zara and Amazon's private labels and Target and Levi's pace setters like Stella McCartney and the Caring Group and Eileen Fisher and obviously many, many others in between. And because those brands have sent a consistent message to their suppliers, we now have viscose producers that represent 90% of global production with similar commitments in place. We work with viscose producers quite closely. We've introduced an audit process, which is conducted by a third party. And then every year we feed those audit results as well as other environmental criteria. We assess and rank the environmental performance of producers. And we now have 52% of global viscose production verified at low risk or attributed with a green shirt. So in 5 years, we've gone to, we've basically now got over half of this global supply chain verified at low risk of sourcing from a high carbon, high biodiversity value forests.
Canopy's work does not stop with these environmental achievements. It also promotes the rights and well-being of communities who live in and are from the forests. It does so by leveraging the ability that large brands have to create economic and political incentives through their customer base.
The Great Bear Rainforest, which is a very charismatic forest landscape. It's on the west coast of North America. It's 6.5 million hectares. It stretches from the Alaskan border most of the way down the British Columbian coast of Canada. 90% of the Great Bear Rainforest used to be open for logging. But because international customers engaged the forest industry and government decision makers and said, we don't want to be contributing to the destruction of spirit bear habitat or to, like these ancient forest ecosystems. We need you to find a different pathway forward. That created the incentive and the imperative for, government and industry to sit at the negotiations table with the conservation community and First Nations leaders to work out a different pathway forward. And so if we fast forward, through many hours of painful meetings for people involved in that process, we have the Great Bear Rainforest now, 85% of that landscape is formally protected or legally off limits to logging. There has been a significant advancement in human well-being and a recognition of First Nations governments in the area. It's a fantastic example of the power of the marketplace to help create legacies that are, none of us can individually make happen by ourselves.
In terms of conservation, so many jurisdictions are really struggling in terms of how to find new business model to function. So that's another great blueprint.
We brought a delegation of leaders from the Loser ecosystem in Indonesia to the Great Bear Rainforest. The Loser ecosystem is an equally charismatic landscape. It's the last place on earth where orangutans, elephants, rhinos, and tigers all still coexist in the wild. Decision makers, political decision makers in that area are looking for how can they improve the economic well-being of their people. If you look elsewhere in Sumatra, there's a sea of eucalyptus plantations and palm oil plantations, like an heavily industrialized land base that has been environmentally very damaging and a disaster for the global climate. And so we brought those decision makers to British Columbia so that they could see the potential of a different pathway forward, a pathway where ecotourism, other conservation-based services like carbon credits, nature-based carbon credits, other conservation-based economies could actually help sustain and enrich the local economy without it coming at the heavy price tag of environmental destruction, which ultimately forecloses future economic options.
Looking ahead, Canopy is intensifying its efforts in the fashion industry, as 48% of the supply chain still needs to move out of high carbon, high biodiversity value forest. It also looks at disturbing the packaging industry, whose size multiplied with COVID and the e-retail boom. But in addition to focusing on the big drivers of deforestation, Canopy wants to engage stakeholders in designing next generation solutions.
If we're actually going to protect 30 to 50% of the world's forest by 2030, that means we need to use 50% less wood fiber. And so we need to diversify the fiber basket that we use to make the things that, are part of modern day society. And so Canopy's developed a $69 billion infrastructure blueprint or roadmap for climate and biodiversity stabilization. It's called Survival, a pulp thriller, because this next decade is going to be a one to hang on for. What it does is it maps out, okay, if we're going to protect 50% of the world's forest by using 50% less wood fiber, what do we use instead? Straw makes excellent pulp for paper, for packaging production, and even for textiles. And then there's microbial cellulose, which you can just grow on food waste. And so the Survival roadmap really focuses in and maps where that fiber is available and what kind of production capacity could be built in India that utilizes straw, or in North America that utilizes waste textiles, or straw, or Europe or Southeast Asia. And we're now starting to mobilize investment as well as brand support to basically make survival a reality over the course of the next decade, to bring those really tangible, alternative, more circular economy products to market at scale.
Reflecting on her journey and the speed and scale of change that Canopy has managed to deliver over the past 20 years, Nicole wished she had been even bolder. And she feels that COVID gives every one of us the perfect opportunity to take bold steps for change.
I think, COVID has really shown two things. When we go in and log these intact forest ecosystems, we're unleashing these pathogens that we have no resistance to. And so MERS, Ebola, SARS, COVID-19, these are diseases, epidemics and pandemics that we've had to grapple with just over the last 15 years. And 75% of new diseases that humanity is grappling with are crossing the animal-human barrier. And so I think COVID has really heightened awareness for business leaders that, if we don't want to be continuing in this cycle of social and economic disruption, then we really have to work out how to keep these intact landscapes. And then the other thing that COVID has shown is that we can change overnight if we have the right incentives. And so I think there's an element that COVID has kind of brought to all of us that, is the perfect juncture to jump in with both feet, wherever you are. If you're working within a brand, if you're an investor, if you're working within a producer, like, you are in a position to be able to really drive change in this turnaround decade for our planet. And my experience is that executives that are working within brands are some of the most powerful advocates for environmental change today.
And for these executives, Nicole has a few words of advice.
I think I have two pieces. One is, don't be afraid of NGO collaborations. We're not so scary. We don't bite. Well, some of us don't. It feels like the nexus of business and NGO collaborations, it's a really creative space. And there's a lot of change being driven out of those collaborations. The other thing that I would say is that, now is the time to be bold, right? Like it's, if you're a manager and a senior executive within a company, then you have the ability to really drive incredible change. Like executives are some of the most powerful advocates for environmental change today. And so I would just say, look for ways that you can bring your values into work, and how you can really help your company, not just ensure that your own house is in order and that your own supply chains aren't damaging. Like not being damaging is clearing a fairly low bar. Like let's have companies really aspire to create positive change. Put sustainability into a pre-competitive space, work with your peers, work with your producers, work with NGOs to really help accelerate the transition to conservation and to a circular economy.
Mission to Change is a podcast by the INSEAD Hoffman Global Institute for Business and Society, in collaboration with Intent. Created and produced by Human Humans. Original music, sound design, and mixing by Palomino. Special thanks to Kritika Subramanian and Maria Latori. For more, you can go to insead.edu/mission to change.